The centerpiece of the Hargrove dining table that Thanksgiving was a 17-pound turkey, golden and glazed, surrounded by dishes that Margaret, my mother-in-law, had spent 3 days preparing from scratch. The candlelight was warm and deliberate, the kind of warm that photographs beautifully and feels nothing like warmth at all. I had posted a picture of the table setting to Instagram 2 hours before the guests arrived, and by the time we sat down to eat, it already had 214 likes. People loved what we had built, what we appeared to be. Daniel and Claire Hargrove, 34 and 32 respectively, owners of a 4-bedroom colonial in Westfield, New Jersey, attendees of charity galas, subscribers to the kind of life that arrives pre-curated. I ran my own marketing consultancy with 11 full-time employees and a client list I had assembled entirely through my own effort over 7 years. Daniel was a partner at his father's real estate development firm. Together, we looked exactly like what everyone in that room had always wanted us to look like, which was, I had slowly come to understand, the entire point of us. Margaret passed the cranberry sauce with a smile that carried a footnote. "Claire, you must be exhausted running that business all week and still making it here," she said, in the tone people use when they want credit for the compliment while delivering a small wound beneath it. I told her I wasn't exhausted at all. She touched her pearls and nodded the way she always did when she'd made her point and wanted to move on before anyone could respond properly. Across the table, Daniel's younger sister Brooke was speaking to her husband in a low, conspiratorial murmur, and his brother Thomas was refilling his wine with the casual urgency of a man who needed it. Robert Hargrove, Daniel's father, sat at the head of the table and said very little, which was unusual for a man who generally considered silence a resource to be conserved and deployed strategically. I had noticed the shift weeks before that dinner, though I had spent considerable energy explaining it away. Daniel had stopped engaging in the kind of conversations that required him to look directly at me, the ones about the future, about whether we were happy, about what we each actually wanted versus what we had agreed to want years ago when we were different people. Every time I steered us towards something real, he found a soft exit: his phone, a work call, fatigue. The Hargroves, meanwhile, had begun asking pointed questions about timelines that had nothing to do with mine. When was I planning to scale back the business? Had we considered that a certain kind of life required certain kinds of sacrifices? Margaret once told me, over brunch, that a woman could have ambition or a family, and that the women who claimed otherwise were simply lying to themselves or to their husbands. I had laughed because I didn't know what else to do with it. That night at dinner, I felt the evaluation more acutely than I ever had. Every glance held a measurement. Every pause in conversation felt loaded with something already decided. I was performing for a jury that had already reached its verdict, and I was the only one at the table who hadn't been handed a copy of it. I reached for my wine and watched Robert set down his fork with the quiet finality of a man concluding something. Then my father-in-law stood up and slid something across the table. The envelope was cream-colored, the expensive kind with a texture you notice, and it traveled the length of the mahogany table with a horrible, frictionless ease, coming to rest against my water glass as though it had rehearsed the journey. I looked at Robert, who had already returned to his seat with the composed expression of a man who had executed a business transaction and was now simply waiting for the other party to process the terms. I looked at Daniel, who was staring at his plate with the focused attention of someone studying a painting he had never actually liked, but had agreed to hang in his home years ago, and now couldn't find a graceful way to remove. I looked at Margaret, at Brooke, at Thomas's wife, at every face arranged around that table, and what I found in all of them was the same thing: the rehearsed neutral expression of people who already know the end of the story and are watching you read the first page. I opened the envelope without asking what it was, because the asking would have given them the performance they wanted. Inside were documents, clean and formally typeset, arranged in the precise order that a very competent attorney had decided would be most efficient. Divorce papers, prepared and already signed on Daniel's line, his signature sitting at the bottom of the page in the careful, practiced hand he used for things that mattered to him. The grounds listed were irreconcilable differences, which is the legal system's polite way of saying that someone made a decision and needed the paperwork to reflect it. The terms were detailed. The property division had been thought through carefully. My consultancy, interestingly, had been valued by someone at some point without my knowledge, and a specific figure appeared next to it in a column labeled Marital Assets. Robert spoke first, because Robert always spoke first. He said that this was not a decision made lightly, that it had been arrived at after a great deal of reflection and with everyone's long-term well-being in mind. He used the phrase, "what's best for the family," twice in 4 sentences, and the second time he said it, Margaret nodded in a way that suggested she had been waiting months to nod exactly like that. There was language about stability, about legacy, about the kind of future the Hargrove name required and what that future demanded of the people attached to it. At no point during this presentation did my husband speak. He sat in his chair and he let his father deliver the verdict on our marriage while he examined the middle distance, and that silence, not the papers, not the table full of witnesses, not the rehearsed speech from Robert, was the thing that actually broke something open inside me. I read every page. I read the footnotes. I read the asset valuation appendix. I set each page face down on the table when I finished it, one after another, with the calm, methodical attention of a woman reviewing a contract before signing, because that is precisely what I was doing. Margaret asked softly if I was all right, and the question was so structurally dishonest that I almost admired it. The table held its breath, waiting for the collapse, waiting for the tears or the raised voice or the dramatic exit that would confirm their narrative and make them feel justified. I gave them nothing, because what they didn't know was I had already found something they tried to hide.
6 weeks earlier, on a Tuesday afternoon when Daniel was at a client dinner and the house was quiet in the way that sometimes made it feel less like a home and more like a stage between performances, I had been looking for the insurance documents for our car renewal and had opened the wrong drawer in Daniel's home office. What I found was not the insurance documents. It was a folder, thin but deliberate, containing a single-page agreement, a legal document bearing my husband's signature and his father's, dated 14 months prior, outlining the terms by which Daniel would assume full senior partnership of Hargrove Development upon the dissolution of his marriage to me, contingent on that dissolution occurring before his 35th birthday, which was 4 months away. The agreement also contained a clause relating to a capital transfer of $3.2 million from a Hargrove family trust into an account held solely in Daniel's name, to be completed upon proof of finalized divorce. There was a secondary document attached, correspondence between Robert and a law firm I didn't recognize, that made clear the asset valuation of my consultancy had been commissioned privately, without my knowledge or consent, as part of the preparation for this proceedings, likely constituting a violation of at least 2 statutes my attorney would later identify with brisk professional interest. I had stood in that office for a long time. Then I had taken photographs of every page on my phone, replaced the folder exactly as I had found it, and gone downstairs to make dinner. Over the following weeks, I had moved with a precision I hadn't known I was capable of. I met with a family law attorney named Sandra Park, who reviewed the photographs and told me, with the measured understatement of someone who had seen a great deal, that I had several interesting options. I gathered additional documentation, bank records I was legally entitled to access, communication threads, the formal correspondence between Robert and the firm, a copy of the trust agreement obtained through Sandra's office via channels that were entirely legitimate and entirely invisible to the Hargroves. I transferred my business accounts into a structure Sandra recommended. I moved personal funds. I did all of this quietly, in the margins of ordinary days, while continuing to attend the Hargroves' Sunday dinners and like Margaret's Facebook posts, and perform the marriage with the same competence I had always brought to things that required sustained effort in exchange for diminishing returns. Back at the table, I finished reading the divorce papers. I took the pen that Robert had placed beside the envelope, a detail so considered it almost deserved acknowledgement, and I signed my name on the appropriate line with the same clean, unhurried script I used for everything. I placed the pen down, and I reached into my bag, which was hanging on the back of my chair as it always was, and I removed my own envelope, which was a practical manila one because I had not been trying to make a visual statement, only a factual one. I set it on the table, I slid it toward Robert with the same trajectory his had taken toward me, and I told him, in a voice that I was pleased to find completely steady, that before anyone left the table, they should probably read what was inside. And suddenly, the entire table went silent for a very different reason.
The silence lasted long enough to be genuinely uncomfortable, which is a different and more meaningful silence than the theatrical one that had preceded it. Robert opened the envelope with the careful hands of a man who had spent a lifetime controlling the terms of every room he entered, and was now experiencing the specific unease of a room that had been rearranged without his knowledge. Inside was a summary document Sandra had prepared. 4 pages, clearly organized, containing the photographs of the partnership agreement, a legal analysis of the undisclosed asset valuation and its implications, correspondence between Robert's firm and the attorney who had prepared Daniel's divorce papers, and a preliminary assessment of the financial and legal exposure the Hargrove family faced, depending on how the next several weeks proceeded. There was also a brief cover note, in Sandra's firm but not unkind language, indicating that copies of this package had already been sent to 2 other parties whose names Robert would recognize, and whose involvement would become relevant if the divorce proceedings were contested or if any attempt was made to undervalue my business interests during settlement. Daniel spoke for the first time since before the envelope had crossed the table. He said my name, just my name, with an inflection I hadn't heard from him before, something between confusion and the early stages of understanding what had actually happened. Margaret set down her fork. Brooke's husband refilled his wine and then set the bottle down very carefully, like someone trying to make himself invisible. Robert read in silence, and his face moved through several expressions that his careful public manner had probably never allowed before, arriving finally at something I can only describe as the look of a man recalculating a negotiation he had believed was already concluded. He did not speak for a long time. When he did, he said that there were misunderstandings that needed to be addressed privately, that matters of family complexity were always best handled without outside involvement, and I told him, calmly and finally, that I agreed, and that my attorney's contact information was on the last page. I collected my bag. I thanked Margaret for the turkey, which had in fact been very good. I walked through the foyer I had helped furnish and out the front door into the cold November air, and I sat in my car for approximately 4 minutes before I drove away, which was the amount of time I needed to let my hands stop shaking, not from fear, but from the extraordinary physical sensation of putting down something extremely heavy that you have been carrying for a long time, without fully acknowledging the weight of it. The divorce was finalized the following March, and Sandra, as it turned out, was extraordinary at her work. The settlement reflected the full and accurate value of what I had built. The Hargrove family's partnership agreement became the subject of a separate legal matter that cost Robert a significant sum and a more significant measure of the reputation he had spent his entire adult life constructing. Daniel, freed into the future his family had engineered for him, found that it fit him less comfortably than the brochure had suggested. I heard this secondhand and found that I felt nothing in particular about it, which was itself a kind of answer. My consultancy grew. I hired 2 more people in the spring. I moved to a smaller apartment in the city that was entirely mine and contained not a single thing I didn't want in it. I slept better than I had in years. They thought they were ending my life that night, but they were actually handing me my freedom.